December 14, 1946. Bavaria. A low fog hung over the snow-covered roads of rural Upper Palatinate, turning the barbed wire outlines of the American-run POW camp into little more than shadowed ghosts behind the morning frost. The sky was pewter gray, the trees skeletal, the air so still that when the truck tires ground over the gravel path near the checkpoint, it echoed across the hills like thunder. She had no business being there. Civilians weren't permitted, not really, especially not civilians like her. But her letter had reached someone in the American command, and someone, somewhere, had signed off. Her name was Liesl Hartman, age 32, widow. She stood just 5'3" and weighed barely 100 pounds, but her presence was heavier than the winter. The guards at the gate checked her papers again and again, looked at the old photograph she clutched in gloved hands, then stepped aside. No one asked why she came. No one dared. It had been 3 years since her last letter to him went unanswered. 2 since the telegram had arrived, unsigned, informing her of his probable death in the forests outside Kursk. 1 since she'd buried a box of soil and dog tags in a plot marked with his name. His name was Friedrich Hartmann. He had worn the field gray uniform of the Wehrmacht. He had marched with the 11th Panzer Division, and he had vanished like a ghost when the tide of war collapsed in the east. But Liesl had never really believed he was dead. What she did believe, or rather, what she had convinced herself of, was that this journey to the American camp would end that chapter. One final look, one last humiliation before grief could settle properly in her bones. She would walk into that camp, scan the sea of hollowed faces, and not find him. She was certain of it. She was wrong. The first thing she noticed was not the smell, although it was there, faint, the mingling of coal smoke, old boots, and the lingering stink of human desperation, but the silence. The kind of silence that hums, that lives between faces too tired to talk. Thin men in tattered uniforms watched her pass, their expressions unreadable. Some looked away. Some stared. One whistled softly, then fell silent when another prisoner elbowed him. And then she saw him. Not at first, not clearly. She saw a man, seated on a bench beside a lean-to wall, reading or pretending to read a brittle book with one corner torn off. His hair was longer, his cheeks sunken. The greatcoat he wore wasn't German, probably American surplus. But then he turned, and the breath left her chest in a single, ragged sob. Because the man who turned his head had Friedrich's eyes. Not just the color, that muddy hazel tinged with green, but the way they settled on her, wide, then narrow, then as still as glass. Like they couldn't believe the world was real anymore. He stood slowly, the book dropped, his mouth opened but made no sound. And neither of them moved. Not until she took one step forward, then another, and the distance of 3 years collapsed in the space between heartbeats. He whispered her name, once, the way a man might say a prayer after forgetting how to believe in anything at all. Liesl. She didn't speak. Her gloved hand reached for his face and hovered there, trembling, as if afraid he would vanish. The other prisoners had stopped moving. The guards, too. The whole camp, this frozen, grim little corner of a broken world, stood still. And Friedrich Hartmann, thought dead on the Eastern Front, put his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. She wept into the wool of his coat. He wept into the stillness of her presence. And somewhere in the cold distance, a bell rang, a morning formation that no one moved to attend. Because war had taken nearly everything from them. But not everything. Not yet. When the tears dried and the questions poured in, how, when, why didn't you write? He spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word had to be dug from a place long buried. There had been a river crossing, Soviet tanks, a night that never ended, shrapnel in the shoulder, infection, a burning field hospital under bombardment, a train to Minsk, a forced march, captivity. Then silence. No pen, No letters, just barbed wire, bad food, numbers on his chest, and the long, slow erasure of identity. He hadn't known she was still alive. He hadn't believed anyone was. She listened without interrupting, not because she lacked questions, but because in that moment she could hear the answers without needing them explained. She saw them in the way his hands shook, in the angle of his jaw, in the way he said her name like it was the only word he remembered. They let her stay for the day. The guards brought tea. Someone found a wooden chair. She sat beside him for hours, watching the sky shift from gray to white to the first hints of sun. And when the guards came to say she'd have to leave before nightfall, he stood again, slowly, as if waking from a long sleep. "Will I see you again?" he asked. She reached into her coat, pulled out the old photo, the one of them before the war, standing beside a lake, smiling into a future that never came, and handed it to him. "Yes," she said, "you will." When she walked out of that camp, her footprints melted into the snow before anyone could trace them. But Friedrich Hartmann stared at that photo for hours after she was gone. And when his name was finally called, when his number matched a name on the release board, and the trucks came again a month later to send a wave of POWs home, he carried that photo in the inside pocket of his coat. He stepped off the truck in Regensburg on a mild afternoon in January 1947. She was waiting at the gate. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She walked to him, took his hand in hers, and together they stepped back into a country neither of them fully recognized. But they were together. And for people like them, survivors of a world that had shattered, that was enough. They did not rebuild the Reich. There was no glory to chase, no banners left to wave. But they built something else. A kitchen with a wood stove, a chair that creaked when she rocked in it, a garden with beans and onions and eventually violets. And sometimes, late at night, she would lie beside him and listen to his breathing, steady and quiet. And he would dream not of tanks or guns or blood in the snow, but of a gate, a photograph, and a voice calling his name across a frozen yard. She had found him where the war had buried him. And nothing, not time, not silence, not even the dead weight of 1,000 lost souls could take that back. It had been winter when she came, but when he saw her, he remembered what spring felt like. And when people asked how he survived, he always answered the same way. "She came for me." The first letter she wrote after he vanished had been returned unopened, not undeliverable, not marked missing, just returned, folded, creased oddly at the corners as if someone had handled it too long and then set it aside without reading. That was late summer, 1943. By then the rumors about Kursk were already spreading, an entire division swallowed by Soviet tanks, whole companies scattered, taken prisoner or killed in forests too deep to escape. Names of survivors weren't printed in papers anymore, just numbers, casualty figures, losses, withdrawals. She wrote again in October, again in November. By December, Liesl Hartmann had memorized the silence that followed each letter, the way it settled over her apartment like snow on rooftops, quiet, cold, and final. Her sister Ruth told her to stop writing. "He's gone, Liesl, don't drag it out." But she didn't stop. She wrote until the ink ran out, until stamps were worthless, until the walls of her town in Amberg cracked from Allied bombs and the postal service disintegrated into chaos. Then she wrote in her head, words carved across nights without sleep, the way his hands felt when he buttoned her coat, the way he stood too straight after returning from training, the half-smile he wore whenever he read something over her shoulder. She kept him alive inside her long after Germany stopped breathing. And all the while, she never changed her name, not when the notary suggested it, not when the housing forms asked her status, not when the priest handed her the folded flag and called her a widow. Because something in her, something not entirely rational but unshakable, said Friedrich wasn't gone. She never expected to be right. In the spring of 1945, when the war ended and American units rolled through her village with chocolate, cigarettes, and broken German, she had seen the strange look in their eyes, a mix of pity and suspicion. As if every German woman was either a victim or a collaborator, and they couldn't decide which until they asked the right questions. She answered quietly. She worked hard. She traded bread for soap and scrap wool for coffee, but what she really waited for was access, a sliver of possibility. Then, one afternoon, she overheard a local priest talking to an American officer in a cafe. Something about a temporary POW camp near Regensburg. Hundreds of Wehrmacht soldiers. Most hadn't been processed. And a name, Hartmann. She didn't sleep that night. By dawn, she was on a truck, and 2 days later, she was staring through barbed wire at the man they told her had died on the Eastern Front. When she saw him, truly saw him, it was as if a black and white photograph had come to life in color. Older, thinner, but unmistakable. He walked the same way, even with his shoulder hunched from an old wound. He touched his chest when he was nervous. He tilted his head when he thought someone was lying. He did all of it just the same, and for a moment she wanted to scream. Not from joy, from anger. He was alive, he had lived, and he hadn't written her. But when she saw his eyes, hollowed by camps, stained by 100 winters of silence, the anger melted, because she realized something that day. It hadn't just been war that had taken him, it had been erasure. He had vanished into history, and she had reached in and pulled him back. They gave her 4 hours that day. She used every second. They sat on a wooden bench beneath a rusted corrugated roof while a guard nearby pretended not to listen. He told her what he remembered, which wasn't much. There'd been an artillery barrage east of Kharkov, then a retreat, then nothing but hunger, boots falling apart, hands turned blue, names forgotten. A man beside him had died holding a spoon. Another had tried to chew through frost. He didn't remember capture. He remembered snow and then waking up in a shed with American MPs standing over him. No documents, no identification, just a tag number and the wrong uniform. They assumed he was Volkssturm, treated him like conscripted cannon fodder. For nearly 6 months he didn't even tell them his name. He wasn't hiding, he just didn't remember. Until one morning, a nurse handed him a stack of returned mail, German letters they couldn't deliver. One of them had her name on it. His hands shook when he said it. He had seen her handwriting, and the name Liesel had opened a door he didn't know was closed. And through that door came her face, her voice, her stubborn refusal to let go. He told the guards his name that day. They wrote it down, but no one checked it against the lists. Until she did. That night after she left the camp, he didn't sleep. He lay awake on the straw mat, staring at the ceiling, fingers curled tightly around the photo she had given him. The next morning, when roll call came, the guards found him already standing beside the wire, waiting, alert. They asked nothing, just pointed him toward the intake office. Liesel, meanwhile, walked back to Amberg with wind in her coat and ice on her boots, but heat in her chest. She didn't tell Ruth what she'd seen, didn't tell the priest. She simply waited. And when the postcard came from the American authorities, confirming a POW named Friedrich Hartmann had been released and was en route to his home village, she read it twice, then folded it, then placed it beside the telegram that had once told her he was dead. Later she would show both to him. He would hold them in silence. Then carefully, he would rip the telegram in two and burn it in the stove. But the postcard, he kept that. Because it was the first time in years someone had written his name down without erasing it. They found a room above the baker's shop. Friedrich worked stacking crates for the Americans at the rail depot. Liesel taught arithmetic to the children of rubble clearers and widows. They were not rich, not celebrated, no one called them heroes. But they were alive, together. At night she would run her fingers down the long scar beneath his shoulder blade. He never talked about how it got there, and she never asked. He would lie beside her, one hand resting over hers, and whisper fragments of dreams, not nightmares but half-memories, walking beside a frozen river, staring at a white wall, a taste of salt in a tin cup. Sometimes he would cry in his sleep, quietly, like a child. And she would pull him closer and whisper, "It's over." But they both knew it was. Not really. War never truly ends. It just stops writing headlines. They had lived in a time when names vanished, and they had found each other again anyway. That was their victory. It wasn't in medals. It was in survival. And every morning, when she brewed tea, and he laced up boots still 2 sizes too big, American issue, they smiled at each other like people who had outrun death. Because they had. He never remembered the first hit, only the cold, the way the wind howled down the tree line like it had teeth, and the snow soaked into the seams of his uniform before he even felt the damp. The Soviets didn't announce their artillery with whistles, not like the British or Americans. It simply came. Shells hit the rear supply lines first, then the road behind them, then the horizon. By the time the ones aimed at them arrived, there was no sound, just impact, trees splintering, trucks shredded, voices swallowed in thunder. Friedrich Hartmann had gone to the Eastern Front with his unit in January 1943, just after the collapse at Stalingrad. His company commander, a man named Weber, told them the worst had already passed, that they were the cleanup crew, that Germany still held the initiative. He believed it for 2 days. After that, it was only snow, mines, and maps that didn't match what was under their feet. The forest near Kharkov was the kind that killed you slow, pine so thick you couldn't see 10 meters ahead, ice in your boots by morning, wolves close enough to smell the blood on bandages. They moved at night, slept standing up, ate boiled grain out of helmets. When the Soviet shells hit them, the squad scattered. He saw one man, Kruger, the youngest, vanish into a crater mid-sentence. No scream, just silence. Friedrich Dove left, landed hard on his side, felt the white-hot stab of metal rip through his shoulder. And then nothing. He woke in snow, alone. The shelling had stopped, but the silence was worse. His rifle was gone, his canteen was frozen solid, he had one glove. He walked east, then south, then east again. He wasn't thinking tactically. He was bleeding, disoriented. He saw a church steeple once and thought it was Liesel's hand reaching for him. That night he collapsed behind a half-burned shack. Wolves howled nearby. He didn't care. The next morning, Russian voices woke him, not shouting, calm, too calm. He reached for his sidearm and found only snow. They didn't shoot him, just pointed. One of them offered a cigarette. He never spoke, not then, not later. When they dragged him back to the collection point, a barn-turned-prison, he said nothing. When they took his tags, his coat, his name, he let them. Because he had already lost it himself. The next few weeks blurred into mud, then blood, then fevers. At some point, someone cleaned his wound with vodka and a rag. Another time, someone else kicked him for not standing fast enough during roll call. They moved him west, then north, each camp smaller than the last. He stopped marking time, stopped asking. One day, he was placed on a train with 200 others. No one said where they were going. When the doors opened, it was France. And the guards wore American uniforms. He didn't believe it at first. He'd hallucinated before, but this was real, clean uniforms, accents he didn't understand. They pointed, he followed. He was tagged, numbered, processed, but no one asked him anything, not even his name. He gave them nothing. For a while that seemed easier, safer. Until that day in the makeshift infirmary, where he sat wrapped in 2 blankets, shivering, when the nurse handed him a bundle of undeliverable letters. The first one bore his name. His full name. The handwriting, sharp, tilted, unmistakable, shattered something in his chest. He asked for a pencil, then paper, then a name to give the guards. And the moment he spoke it aloud, Friedrich Joseph Hartmann, he felt like a man returning from the dead. They nodded, wrote it down, didn't ask questions. It didn't matter to them. One more name on one more form. But to him it was everything. When Liesel came, months later, it felt like both a miracle and an inevitability. Because no matter how deep the war had buried him, she had found the thread. The memory of her, the sound of her breath, the way she touched his shoulder before they slept, had never really left him. It had just quieted, faded behind walls he didn't know were there. Now, with her beside him, the world began to return. Slowly, unevenly, but it returned. He flinched when boots stomped too loudly. He slept lightly. He woke gasping sometimes. But he smiled more. They walked markets. She made soup. He told stories. At first only small ones about a dog in Poland, a stolen chicken, a funny thing a French guard once said. Later the harder ones came. About the march through the snow, about the boy who froze with his eyes open, about the man who tried to dig a grave with his fingers. Liesel listened, never interrupted. Sometimes when his voice cracked, she touched his knee. He never said thank you. But she never asked him to. Because she understood what survival meant. Not just breathing, but returning. Liesel didn't notice when her world began to shrink. Not all at once, not in dramatic collapse. It happened the way ceilings begin to rot, first a stain, then a drip, then a silence that seems too still to be real. The first time she realized the food cards were being reduced, she said nothing. The butcher just shrugged. "Front needs it more than you do," he mumbled, and handed her half the sausage she was due. She nodded, said dank. That was in spring of 1944. By summer, flour had disappeared completely. Soap became a memory. The church bells rang not for mass but for air raids. Still she carried herself the same. Coat buttoned to the top, scarf tied carefully, hair pinned. She refused to fray. Every Tuesday, she walked to the corner post station and asked the same question. Any letters for Hartmann? And every Tuesday, the man behind the counter, always the same man, his nose long, fingers yellowed with tobacco, would shake his head without meeting her eyes. He stopped needing to look after a while. She walked home slowly on those days, pausing in front of the notice board where the town hung casualty lists, each one typed, sealed, posted under glass. Every week a new sheet. She'd stare at it until her eyes blurred, then she'd walk on. She never once let her name appear in the widow's circle, even when Ruth said, gently, that it might help with ration access. "I'm not a widow," Liesel answered. And she meant it. They had married in 1940 on the coldest day of February. The priest's breath had fogged in the air when he pronounced them man and wife. Friedrich's hand shook when he slipped the ring on her finger, not from nerves, but because he hadn't eaten properly in days. Training had been brutal, sleep rarer than food. But when he kissed her, he smiled. A wide, crooked, sheepish smile that made her forget how tired he looked. He had written her once from the Eastern Front, just once. January 1943. A short letter, 6 sentences. Cold, morale holding, missing home, still healthy, send photos, love always, Friedrich. She kept it in a tin box, beneath their wedding certificate, next to a small piece of chalk he'd used to mark her bicycle tire back when they first met. She read that letter like scripture. When the telegram came, she didn't faint, didn't scream, just unfolded it once, smoothed the corners, and read. "We regret to inform you that Obergefreiter Friedrich Hartmann has been declared missing in action, presumed dead, near Kursk. That was all. No rank, no signature, no comfort. Just finality. She read it again, then a third time, then placed it in the same box, not above the wedding certificate, beneath it. She didn't tell Ruth, not for 3 days. When she finally did, Ruth cried harder than she did. The others in town offered condolences. The baker's wife brought flowers. The shoemaker said nothing, just handed her a small black armband. She put it in a drawer. But the day that changed her came when she saw a woman outside the ration depot, kneeling in the mud. Her child was screaming. Loud, desperate cries that cut through the gray morning like sirens. Liesl approached, knelt, asked what was wrong. "No bread," the woman whispered. "They said only families of the living." Liesl reached into her satchel, pulled out a tin of preserved meat, a treasure she had bartered for, and handed it over without speaking. Then she stood, walked inside. And when the clerk asked for her name, she answered clearly. "Hartman, my husband is alive." He hesitated, looked at her, looked down at the list, then nodded. She took her rations and walked home, heart pounding. That night she wept for the first time. Not because she believed Friedrich was dead, but because the world believed it so completely that it made her doubt. Still she waited. And when the war ended, when the shells stopped falling and the leaflets fluttered from the sky and American voices replaced German ones, she stepped into the streets without fear. She spoke little English, enough to understand orders, enough to ask about prisoners. They laughed at first. The young American with the red hair who handed her a chocolate bar asked her if she had a sweetheart behind the lines. She answered coldly, "My husband is behind your barbed wire." He didn't laugh again. Eventually someone gave her a form, then another, then a name. Not his full name, just a fragment. Hartman, possible match, Regensburg sector. That was all she needed. The next morning she packed bread, 3 boiled eggs and the photo from the tin box. And she walked to the edge of a country still bleeding from its own collapse, with mud on her boots and frost in her lungs. Because if the world wouldn't find him, she would. And if he was gone, truly gone, she would look him in the eye and forgive him for it. But until then, she belonged to no one. Not the Reich, not the Allies, not the silence. She belonged to herself. And to him. Even if the whole world said otherwise. The apartment above the bakery smelled like smoke and yeast. Smoke from the coal stove that never quite warmed the walls. Yeast from the rising dough each morning that seeped through the floorboards and into their clothes. They moved in 2 weeks after Friedrich's release. The Americans gave him a document with his name, a number, and a stamp. That was all. No back pay, no pension, no apology. But it was enough. Enough to make him a man again in the eyes of the occupation authorities. Enough to open a ration book. Enough to sign a lease. He walked through the front door holding a satchel with his last issued coat and a pair of worn boots tied together by the laces. Liesl stood in the doorway, hair tucked under a kerchief, sleeves rolled to the elbow. She didn't speak, just held the door. And when he stepped through it, the war ended. Not globally, not officially, but for them. There was no furniture at first, just a straw mattress, 1 stool, and a basin they filled from the pump on the corner. Liesl borrowed a kettle from Ruth. Friedrich found a stool behind the bakery and sanded it smooth with a brick. Each day began the same: silence, water, bread, movement. They didn't talk about what had been lost. Not yet. The past hovered, of course, like fog, like damp in the walls, but neither of them touched it. Not until the night the roof leaked. Rain fell hard and steady, and water began to trickle through a crack in the ceiling. Liesl scrambled for a pot, but the water slipped around it, soaking the edge of the mattress. Friedrich watched her struggle. Then he stood, crossed the room, and laid his coat over the damp spot. She stared at him, he looked away. And then she said it. I thought you were dead." He didn't answer right away, just knelt, adjusted the coat. "I was," he said, "a little." She sat beside him. For a long time they said nothing. Then quietly, she began to tell him things. About the air raids, the ration lines, the day she thought the building would collapse and she sat in the stairwell clutching his old army photograph. About the child next door who vanished during a bombing and the dog that slept in the rubble for 3 days waiting for him to return. He listened, said nothing. And then, as the rain fell, he began to tell her things too. About the camp in Poland, where men stole bread from the mouths of the dying. About the Frenchman who sang at night. About the lice, the cold, the time he spent 2 days lying beside a man he thought was asleep but had already frozen stiff. He spoke in pieces, like someone lifting stones from a collapsed house. Each word cost him, but each word made room for the next. That night they fell asleep back to back, their shoulders just touching, the coat still draped over the mattress like a bandage. The next morning, Friedrich found a hammer. He patched the roof with a piece of tin from behind the bakery. Then he went to the rail depot, asked for work. He didn't tell them he had once commanded a squad, didn't mention his rank, his years of service, his wound. He told them he could lift, he could carry, he could take orders. They nodded, handed him gloves. He carried crates for 9 hours straight. When he came home, Liesel had made lentils. He ate in silence. When she reached for his bowl to serve him more, his hand closed around hers. Not tightly, but firmly. That night they slept facing each other. She woke once and found him watching her. He looked like a man studying a map he hadn't seen in years. And slowly, carefully, he leaned forward and kissed her forehead. Nothing more. But everything changed after that. The next week he brought her a comb. It was cracked, missing 2 teeth, but clean. He'd found it in a box of discards from the American PX. She ran it through her hair that night without a word. The week after, she traded sugar for a bar of soap, wrapped it in cloth, left it on his pillow. They spoke more, laughed sometimes. She told him about her father's garden, how the beans always sprouted crooked, but he swore they tasted better for it. He told her about the Hungarian who could juggle, the one who taught him how to play chess with pebbles. They were rebuilding something, not what they had before. That was gone. This was different. Older, quieter, but strong. One day, a boy threw a stone at Friedrich in the street and called him a coward. Liesel stepped between them before Friedrich could move. She stared at the boy until he looked away. Then she turned to Friedrich and said simply, "Come home." He followed. Neither spoke of it again. But after that, he walked a little straighter. They planted radishes in a box beneath the window. She swept the stairs. He oiled the door hinges. And each night, before they blew out the candle, she would reach for his hand. He always gave it. Always. It wasn't shame that marked him. It was invisibility. The returning soldiers wore no medals. The Reich had fallen. The uniforms meant nothing. Whatever pride had once clung to the idea of duty had crumbled beneath the rubble of Berlin. When Friedrich walked through town, people didn't spit. They didn't scowl. They looked past him. Not hatred, something colder. Like they had seen too much and had no room left to see him. He carried crates at the station. Twice a week, a man named Klaus, a veteran too, though Friedrich didn't know from which unit, nodded to him. That was all. No words. At the bakery, they were civil. Bread was handed to Liesel with a smile, but to Friedrich with curt precision. Once a woman asked her, "Was he really yours?" as if she had rescued a stranger from a ditch and brought him home. Liesel didn't answer. Because if she did, she wouldn't be able to stop. Friedrich noticed the stares, the silences, but he said nothing. Instead, he built a table, 3 chairs, a stool. With his hands, splinters in his palms, using wood salvaged from a collapsed schoolhouse. He sanded each piece smooth, rubbed oil into the grain. Liesel would find him some nights sitting at the table he'd made, staring at it like it was something foreign. Once she asked, "Do you want to talk?" He shook his head. But after a long pause, he said, "This table will outlast me." She placed her hand over his. "Not if I'm careful with it." The town didn't forget what he had been. A soldier, a name on a list, then a ghost returned. One day, a letter came from the local authority. A formal request. Would Friedrich Hartmann appear for documentation review regarding his wartime role? He read it twice, placed it on the counter, and said nothing. That night Liesel cooked dumplings. He ate quietly. Then, after the plates were clean, he said, "I didn't shoot civilians. I didn't guard camps. I fought in the snow. I pulled my friend's body off a mine." She nodded. The next morning, they walked to the town hall together. The clerk behind the desk was younger than both of them. Clean shirt, clean hands, ink stains on his fingers. He asked Friedrich for his name, date of service, division. He took notes, asked again if Friedrich had ever served in any punitive units. Friedrich said no. The man behind the desk blinked slowly, wrote it down. Then asked if Friedrich had seen any executions. Friedrich hesitated. "Of civilians?" he asked. The man looked up. "Of anyone?" Friedrich's jaw clenched. "Yes," he said, "deserters." "And you?" "No, I didn't fire. I was told to watch." "And did you?" Friedrich's eyes narrowed. "I closed my eyes." The clerk paused, wrote something down. "You're cleared for Category C limited employment. No relocation authorization. No passport application." They left in silence. Later, Liesel found the letter he'd hidden, stamped with the classification, and read it carefully. Then she folded it, tore it once, and placed it under the leg of the wobbly chair he'd made. He smiled when he saw it, but only with his eyes. In town, whispers still followed them, nothing cruel, just uncertain. The Americans hadn't arrested him. That made people uncomfortable. A neighbor once said to Liesel, "He's quiet, that's worse, isn't it?" She didn't answer. But that night, she sat beside Friedrich while he carved a spoon from cherry wood. And she said, "They don't know what silence costs." He didn't look up, just nodded. Then placed the spoon in her hand. They began to live like people no one expected to survive. He walked to the edge of town every week to fix the bell at the old school. No one asked him to, but he did it anyway. She taught sewing to girls who'd lost mothers in the firebombings. They never asked each other what came next, because the answer was always this. A pot of soup, the creak of the bed frame, the scrape of boots at the door. One day Friedrich found a dog, thin, limping, left behind by someone who had less heart than sense. He brought it home, washed it, said nothing. Liesel named it Otto. Otto slept at their feet. Sometimes he barked at shadows. Friedrich understood that. The town began to forget slowly what it had feared. One man shook Friedrich's hand. Another gave him nails when he heard he was fixing the window frame. These things mattered. They stitched a kind of piece together, not perfect, not whole, but human. And in that fragile return to life, Liesel saw something else bloom. Not happiness, but the thing that comes before it. Possibility. The moment came without warning. It was a Sunday, bright, spring air smelling faintly of wet grass and chimney soot. Liesel had gone to the small market that operated twice a month on the edge of the village, just where the ruins gave way to open pasture. She returned with carrots, a jar of pickled beets, and unusually, a small bottle of ink. When she opened the door, she found Friedrich on the floor. Not collapsed. Not injured. Just kneeling. His hands clutched something. She stepped closer. A letter, yellowed, the edges fraying, the paper soft from too many unfoldings. He didn't notice her at first. He was speaking. Barely audible. We were told it was temporary, just relocation. They lined them up, told them to hand over jewelry. I didn't understand. I thought it was storage. His eyes were locked on the paper. Liesel dropped the carrots. They rolled across the floor, bumping into Otto's paws. He didn't bark. Friedrich looked up, his face. Not like after the war. Not like when she first found him in the camp. This was something deeper, like a man watching himself drown from above. Friedrich. He blinked, as if remembering she existed. I thought it would fade. What? The sound, the boots, the trucks, the way we all pretended not to see. I was in the town before the front, before the orders. I saw the cattle cars. I thought it wasn't my business. She stepped closer, the letter now fully in view. It wasn't addressed to her. The handwriting was rigid, English, typed, stamped with a name she didn't recognize. A report. Transfer of non-combatants from Sector V, 14 February 1943. Civilians registered under Reich Code 861. See subsequent transport to unidentified Eastern facility. Survivors, unknown. It had arrived weeks ago, from one of the American archivists who had visited the camp. They had promised to close the loop on records. Friedrich never mentioned it. Liesel knelt beside him. You didn't load those trains. No, but I saluted the men who did. You were a soldier, a cog. I was a man. I could have asked questions. I could have refused. And been shot. He didn't answer. Instead, he crumpled the paper slightly in his grip, then unfolded it again. I met a woman once. She was just standing at the edge of the platform, not crying, not fighting, just waiting, like she knew it wouldn't matter. He rubbed his thumb over the ink, smearing a line. That was the worst part, the waiting, not knowing what kind of death it would be. Liesel placed a hand over his. You're not in that place anymore. But I carry it, don't you see? Every nail I hammer, every board I cut. I'm trying to build something so the ghosts don't follow me into sleep. She leaned into him, forehead to his. I don't need you to forget. I need you to stay. They sat like that for what could have been minutes or hours. Outside, a breeze swept through the broken window pane. The curtains fluttered. Otto finally stretched and trotted to the door. Later that evening, Friedrich stood in the field behind the house. He dug a small hole, carefully, and placed the letter inside. Not as an act of denial, but containment. He filled it back with earth, pressed it firm. The past was not gone, but it no longer lived on the table. That night, Liesel found him writing. Not a confession. A list. Names he remembered, officers, privates, towns, events, details that would help someone, anyone, one day know what had happened and who had stood where. At the bottom he wrote, I was there, I saw, I remember. He handed it to her silently. Do what you want with it. She placed it in the drawer beneath the sewing kit. Then kissed his temple. Weeks passed, then months. One morning, a man arrived at the door. An American officer, older, civilian clothes but posture that never fully let go of training. I'm looking for Friedrich Hartmann. Friedrich stepped forward. I'm compiling testimonies, not for prosecution, for memory, for record. Friedrich hesitated. The man pulled out a folder. You were at Hammerstein, 1943, Division 122. Friedrich nodded. I have nothing to hide. I believe you. They sat at the table Friedrich had built. The man placed a recorder down. And Friedrich began. His voice didn't shake. He didn't dramatize, didn't flinch. He spoke like a carpenter, describing grain lines. He told the truth. Liesel stood in the doorway, silent. When he finished, the man turned off the recorder. He didn't say thank you. Just, this matters. Then he left. Friedrich didn't ask where the testimony would go. That night he carved another spoon, this one smaller, rounded, a gift for one of the village children whose father hadn't returned. He whittled the handle into the shape of a branch. When he handed it to the girl, she said, "It smells like the forest." He smiled. It was the first time Liesel saw his shoulders lift with the breath, instead of just rise with tension. She touched his hand as they walked home. "You came back." He nodded. "I think I finally did." The years that followed were quiet. Not empty, not dull, but quiet in a way that felt earned. The village rebuilt itself inch by inch. Children grew taller. Bombed-out cellars became new homes, and the POW camp, once guarded by fences and rifles, faded into the forest with time. No one spoke of it anymore, except in whispers, or when someone needed to remember what silence used to cost. Friedrich worked, not tirelessly, just steadily. He rebuilt porches, repaired chairs, fixed the crank on old wells. He never asked for money. Most times he refused it outright. He accepted loaves of bread, jars of jam, mended socks. But if someone tried to say thank you with a salute, even as a joke, his hands would still. And his jaw would clench. Those who knew stopped trying. One winter, Liesel caught pneumonia. The fever came fast and cruel. Friedrich sat by her bed for 4 days straight. Otto refused to leave the foot of the mattress, growling low at anyone who entered with too much noise. On the 5th night, the fever broke. Liesel opened her eyes and whispered, "I'm here." Friedrich nodded but didn't speak. Only when he left the room and found himself outside, standing barefoot in the snow, did he begin to cry. Not from fear, not even from relief, but because for the first time, he understood what it meant to lose someone and get them back. Not a miracle, but close enough. That spring, Liesel planted daffodils in the yard. The soil was still thin, the ground stubborn, but they bloomed anyway. Friedrich began carving animals. Not war memorials, not soldiers. Just animals, birds, mostly squirrels, a fox with one ear. He lined them up on the fence post like silent watchers of the village. Children began naming them. Every year, on the anniversary of her visit to the camp, Liesel would walk the road alone. She didn't speak during those walks. She didn't pray. She just walked. And on her return, Friedrich would have tea waiting. Neither of them ever said why. They didn't need to. One autumn evening, as the sun bruised the horizon gold and purple, a young American arrived in the village. Backpack, journal, a camera slung around his neck. He knocked at the door. "Are you the Hartmans?" Friedrich nodded. "My grandfather was in the 182nd. He mentioned a man named Friedrich. Said you once shared coffee over a broken wall in France. I'm retracing his steps." Friedrich invited him in. The boy sat at their table, the same one, now covered with decades of polish, nicks, and stains from too many coffee mugs. Liesel poured him tea. He asked questions. Not all of them were easy. But Friedrich answered, thoughtfully, calmly. At one point the boy asked, "Do you regret anything?" Friedrich looked at his hands. "I regret not understanding sooner. That silence isn't neutrality. That survival isn't innocence. But mostly," he paused, "mostly I regret that so many people didn't come back, and that the ones who did didn't know what to do with their ghosts." The boy nodded, wrote something down. Before he left, he asked for a photograph. They obliged. He framed them against the doorway, Friedrich's arm around Liesel's waist, Otto curled at their feet. When the shutter clicked, Friedrich blinked. And for a moment, the light felt just like the flash of a flare, not of war but of return. Weeks passed. Winter returned. Liesel aged like an oak tree, strong but slowly hollowing from the inside. She died one morning in her sleep, peaceful without fear. Friedrich buried her in the small meadow behind the house, just beside the daffodils. He carved the headstone himself. No mention of dates, no titles. Just one line. She waited and I came home. For a while Friedrich still walked to the village each morning, still fixed things, still carved. But slower now. Eventually he stopped going. And one day the house was empty. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him in days. They found him sitting in the workshop, eyes closed, hands folded over a block of cedar, half carved into what might have become a sparrow. There was no note. Only a folded cloth beside him. Inside, a small wooden figure. A woman, one hand stretched behind her, reaching. The other forward, holding onto the hand of a man, head down, walking with her. It was simple, crude even, but unmistakable. They buried him next to her. And for years afterward, villagers would pass the small grave and leave flowers. Not because they were famous, but because they had been broken and rebuilt. Because they taught people how to survive not just war, but the weight that follows peace. One year a group of students came, from America, Germany, France. They were studying memory, reconciliation. They read the headstone. They asked who they were. And the guide said, they were ordinary, that's why they mattered. And beneath the grass, where two hands were carved in cedar, holding on across the years, the story ended. Not with a miracle, but with a return, and a silence that no longer hurt.